What's up, mi gente, and thanks for tuning in to Cafecito Cuba. On this episode, we have a lot to cover, not just over the past week, but really over the past 2 weeks. We've seen a lot of big news stories come out of Cuba having to do with Cuba itself, US-Cuba relations, and we're going to dive into everything. We're going to talk about the so-called sonic attacks. There's been a big update on that. Cuban doctors abroad. We're going to talk about December 7th, so not this past Friday, but the Friday before. And that's when a bunch of new business and art regulations went into place, but we're going to talk about the events leading up to that, and we just have a lot to go over today. So hope you guys are ready. This is Cafecito Cuba. We're going to have a great time. Would not necessarily call this a Christmas edition, but I do have this very small matapacua that is probably about the only size matapacua that I can fit in my apartment. But with that, let's get right into it. Oh, almost forgot. A little sip of my coffee. All right, so where to begin? Let's start with the doctors, the sonic attacks. So the doctors that initially examined the 25 affected US diplomats after these so-called sonic attacks occurred, after they started experiencing these symptoms, was a medical team from the University of Miami and also the University of Pittsburgh. They studied the patients in the acute phase of the symptoms. So there was basically not a lot of outside influences, really. It was just the patients, what they were feeling, but not really a sense of why they were feeling what they were feeling. No outside sources, not a lot of media yet. Just bam, like it's a doctor and a patient. And what these guys found was that these patients actually suffered inner ear damage. So it's, objective proof that something did happen to these diplomats. They were having neurosensory dysfunction caused by this inner ear damage that was affecting their perceptions of balance and different things like that. And this contradicts the report that was originally published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by the researchers from the University of Pennsylvania, the doctors there, who basically just cited concussion-like symptoms, mild traumatic brain injury. But what's weird is that none of the diplomats suffered any kind of injury to the head. And so these two reports really contradict in a big way. The original report, not the original report, but the original doctors from Pitt and the University of Miami say that their findings are not consistent with concussion-like symptoms. Now, what's odd is that these doctors just published a report last week, while the report from the University of Pennsylvania was published over the summer, I believe, and they didn't even study the patients until much after the researchers from Miami and Pitt were done with them. So, I don't really know exactly what the deal is with the timing of everything. I just know that we now have objective proof that something did happen. And that feeds into my hypothesis, or really just my belief. What I've always thought is that there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. Cuba should be given access, the US should give Cuba access to our medical findings, the patients, and they should really bring them in on the investigation. We shouldn't just alienate Cuba without really even knowing what happened. Cuba needs to stop saying that the diplomats were just suffering mass hysteria or something like that, and they need to really start taking this seriously, because something actually did happen, but nobody knows whose fault it is. Actually, there was a report that was withdrawn, but originally there was a communication intercepted that made the primary suspect in all of this Russia, actually, not Cuba. Now, the fact that Russia or any other country could do something like this in Cuba without the Cuban government knowing is very, very unlikely. So, maybe the Cuban government did know, they probably did. Either way, I don't know if it was Russia or not. All I know is that something did happen. Cuba needs to take it seriously, and the US needs to react a lot better and work with Cuba to get to the bottom of this. That's always been my take, and I think that this only kind of supports that. Moving on, we're going to talk about the Cuban doctors, the flying Cuban doctors that are all over the world. There's actually 37,000 Cuban doctors operating in countries all over the world, and this brings in $11 billion for the Cuban economy every single year. But recently, Brazil's president-elect, Jair Bolsonaro, and I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, first of all, and I also wrote about this in a recent article I wrote about the current state of Cuba. It was called Trouble in Paradise. So if you guys haven't taken a look at that, it's on my LinkedIn, it's also on the podcast, I read it, it's everywhere. So check that out. But he's a very far-right president-elect, and what he was saying was basically, Cuba treats its medical professionals like slaves, sending them across the world. They keep 70% of their incomes. He questioned the qualifications of the doctors and really the whole nine. And so Cuba obviously took that very offensively, and they said, you know what, we're pulling out of this program. The program is called the Mais Médicos program, and that is not corn doctors. That is, mais is like mas, is like more. It's Portuguese, I guess. I don't speak Portuguese, but yeah, Mais Médicos program. So Cuba basically ended that program, pulled out. It's close to 8,600 medical professionals. Now 2,000 of those are actually defecting and staying in Brazil, to which the president-elect has offered asylum to them. The rest are going back to Cuba. And interestingly enough, some Cuban doctors are actually suing the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO. They're the institution that actually brokered the Mais Médicos program deal between Cuba and Brazil back when they had a more left-leaning president. And they actually get a cut of the Cuban doctors' salaries. So some of these Cuban doctors are saying, you know what, look, this is basically slave labor, and this organization that brokered this deal is actually taking our salaries. So it's like trafficking, kind of. So it's just really this whole convoluted story. But the bottom line is that Cuba's going to take a $400 to $500 million hit to its bottom line, which, because I mean, Cuban doctors they're the main export. It's more than cigars, sugar. Brazil was its second biggest partner as far as to where Cuba exported their doctors to, aside from Venezuela, which is also in the tank. So things are not looking so good for Cuba. And again, if you haven't read that article, it goes into all of this in more depth. But that's what's going on with that program. Moving on, so now we're going to go back to the week of ending in December 7th, so 2 weeks ago. So as you guys may or may not know, there was an entire slew of new business regulations that were coming out. They came out in July, and they were set to go into effect on December 7th. Leading up to those regulations, there was a couple of things that happened. Now, originally, these regulations were much more stringent. Let me backtrack a little bit and just say that in July, when they came out, there was about 593,000 private sector workers in Cuba, in the Cuban private sector. And by the end of October, that was down over 5,000 people to a little over 588,000. So a lot of people were turning in their business licenses because they thought it would be too difficult to operate in the environment that Cuba was going to create. And basically, the original regulations are a lot to get into, but the two main things that were removed was that so back in February, Cuba had frozen the issuance of new business licenses until it could come up with these regulations. Then it consolidated the approved business categories into 123. There used to be a lot more. Under the original regulations, Cuban entrepreneurs were only going to be able to operate with one license. So that means if you were a taxi driver, you couldn't also rent out your house as an Airbnb. It did not go. That's been removed, so now you can do both, but you have to dedicate the appropriate amount of time to each. You can't be doing one while you're doing the other. It's all vague, it's all very convoluted, but it's basically what you need to know is that it's a weakening of that original regulation. Just like with the seating in restaurant seating capacity was going to be capped at 50 chairs. There's big restaurants in Cuba. I don't know how much like La Guarida holds, for example, but could be more than 50. And basically, at the Cuban government's, their MO is they realize, another thing I say in the article is that they realize that they need a free market, capitalist type system, just a free market really. They need a free market to prop up their socialist system. One feeds the other. So they may be trying to employ sort of a Chinese model here, but they want to appease the people, keep them happy, give them just enough to where they feel like this is okay, because they realize they need that private sector, but they don't want it to grow, they don't want it to flourish, they don't want accumulation of property, accumulation of wealth, they don't want expansion, diversification, none of that. And that's really the intent behind these regulations, although the official intent is to avoid people using the black market and also tax evasion. But the reason that Cuban entrepreneurs in the private sector, the reason they use the black market is because they don't have access to wholesale markets, which the state refuses to give them. So that's why you still have the state competing with the private sector, and the people who still are operating and having their own businesses going to other countries to really shop there and then bring those products back to Cuba for resale. But that, under the new regulations, that's going to be clamped down on tremendously. There's one last regulation that I want to talk about quickly, and it's just basically that Cubans were going to have to, Cubans in the private sector, they were going to have to keep a Cuban bank account with at least 3 months worth of earnings or 80% of their earnings so that they wouldn't evade taxes. That regulation, or that limit, has been lowered from 3 months worth to 2 months worth, or 65% of earnings, but it's still a lot, and you still see some people turning in their business licenses, though especially taxi drivers, because there's a lot more regulations for them, which don't really have too much time to get into. But basically vehicle inspections, I mean, look at these old cars, you're going to have vehicle inspections. It's going to be incredibly hard for them. And also they're going to be forced to buy subsidized oil from Venezuela for the cars when the stuff you get on the black market is actually cheaper. So they're suffering a lot from that too. But what I was saying is that the overall sentiment in Cuba was one of rejoice, given the weakening of these regulations that were coming out. All right, so the last thing we need to talk about is Decree 349, which is another regulation that was set to go into effect on December 7th, along with all of those other private business regulations. And this Decree 349 is basically a limit on artistic creativity and artistic freedom of expression in Cuba, where it's a very vague law, so that's issue number one, but it's designed to crack down on any type of art that does not fall within, you know, the revolutionary sort of sphere of a uniform art, for lack of a better word. But of course the government's stance on it is that it really just wants to clamp down on art that is counter-revolutionary, obscene in some way, shape, or form, indecent, but it's not very clear. And so artists are coming out and they're saying, this is a law that really the government is going to, it's a catch-all law that the government is going to use to decide what art is okay and what art isn't. And to get that point across, what the law actually says is that there's going to be government inspectors that are going to be able to inspect any event open to the public. So even that applies to home studios. If an artist has a studio in his house, but the public can come in to view the works, he has to get prior approval from the government to, number one, display those works, and number two, to sell any of that. So these prior approvals are required. If they're not obtained, people could be fined. If a business has an art show or exhibition of any kind and the artist themselves does not receive those approvals, that business could lose their precious business license. So if you follow this law the way that it goes, it's a pretty slippery slope and things look pretty bleak. Now the good news is that the government did backtrack that on Wednesday, December 5th. There was a Mesa Redonda program where the officials from the Ministry of Culture reaffirmed their position, saying, look, this law is not trying to cut down the realm of artistic expression in Cuba. What this law is trying to do is cut down on things that are obscene and bad and sort of clean things up. But here's the problem. Like, art is something subjective. Who's to say that something is art and something is not art? And also, who's to say that you can sell something that you deem as art and that the buyer deems as art just because you don't deem it art? So these inspectors really are the problem. It's up to their subjectivity of what they deem as art that people can sell or not sell, show or not show, and that's an issue. So again, in this Mesa Redonda program, they said, look, it was our bad that we were not clear in this law, and because of that, we're going to put out further guidelines coming up, and until those guidelines come out that will clearly explain that this law is not going to cut down on artistic expression in Cuba, this law will not basically be enforced, and the inspectors will not shut down any events or anything like that leading up. So this was a huge win for the artists in Cuba that had protested. They protested on Monday, December 3rd. Many of them were arrested. Even Tania Bruguera was arrested and put in jail for a little while. She's one of the most famous Cuban artists leading the protest against Decree 349. And so thankfully the government is going to implement that gradually. And last thing we got here, guys, is that also on that same week, Cuba also opened up mobile internet on 3G to over 5 million cell phone users that they have on the island. So that was huge news for Cuba, although not huge news for the rest of the world. They were pretty much one of the last countries to have this service, but they're finally on the map, and it was rolled out slowly. I think it's about like 10 cents per megabyte, but there's 3 different versions of the plan, where basically the highest version is you can get 4 gigs. I think it's 4 gigs a month for $30 a month, which is roughly in line with, you know, international standards globally for internet. But for Cuba, sometimes the official state wage average is actually 25 American dollars a month. So there's no way that it's astronomically unaffordable for Cubans, although you and I know that they get their money another way. No, even in Cuba, which is a much cheaper Caribbean country. You can't live on $30 a month. So in any case, the internet is there. It was amazing. Cubans were extremely happy to receive this service. It's being implemented slowly. But what I want to make a point here of, not only with the internet, but also with the private business regulations, Decree 349, what we saw was that the private business regulations, you know, the things that really upset Cuban entrepreneurs and cuentapropistas were removed from those regulations. Then the artists were upset about 349, and the government said, you know, we're going to implement this very slowly. You guys got the wrong idea about the law, and they backtracked on that. The people that were arrested for protesting were only held for a very short amount of time. On that same week, that Thursday, so December 6th, before these regulations came into effect, that's when Cuba implemented giving its citizens mobile internet on their phones. So what does this say? This says that, to me, I view this as the government. I've never seen the Cuban government act this soft, giving all of these concessions to the people, whereas before, I think it would just be like, you know, this is the way it's going to be, and like it or not, that's the way it's going to be. So I think that they realize a couple of things, that they realize that they're kind of in a hole. They need the private sector. They want to keep their citizens happy. They're maybe trying to employ some sort of a Chinese model where they're giving them just enough to be happy and just enough to be okay with the certain regulations that are coming out, but they will clamp down on it. They're going to have a private sector, but it's not going to be free reign. So there still remains a lot to be seen on how exactly all of these regulations will be adjusted to sort of find a happy medium between what the people really want and what the state wants. And I guess time will tell. You know, we'll see how this works out for the Cuban people. We'll see how it works out for Cuba itself. But you know what? At the end of the day, it's progress. We're moving along. Thank you guys for listening to Cafecito Cuba, mi gente. Take care.